Well, ladies and gentlemen, we do have some big news coming out of the state of Tasmania with the upcoming state election. And it is also big news for the proposed Macquarie Point Stadium, basically the biggest issue in this election. This new poll coming from EMRS that has just dropped in the last few days, it does show the Liberals opening up an 11-point lead over Labor and their primary vote climbing up to 37%. It does show since the start of the election cycle, the Liberals' polling numbers have increased significantly, up 6% from 31. We do have Labor stuck on 26%. There is a fairly high third-party vote with the Greens at 15% and also various independents at 18%. You do have to dive a bit deeper into the independent numbers. Of course, some independents are for the stadium while some are against it. But it does show a big proportion of Tasmanians probably looking outside of the two major parties when it comes to their vote. Now, the stadium, obviously a massive issue when it comes to this election. We did have the no confidence motion passed against the incumbent Liberal Premier, Jeremy Rockliff, because the budget dropped and basically there was a bunch of spending. The concern was that the Tasmanian economy was basically heading into a debt spiral where there was so much spending that if some of it wasn't reined in, then the state would basically be unable to service its debt going forward. Of course, we've got the updated numbers for the stadium. The new bill is around $945 million. Of course, there is a significant contribution from the federal government in that as well, and also $15 million from the AFL. At this stage, the state government is on the hook for around $360 million. There is a question mark. Obviously, the cost of the stadium has gone up by around $230 million since it was announced late last year. There is a big question mark in terms of where is that money going to come from. But it does seem possibly that the pro-stadium people are rallying around the Premier and the Tasmanian people saying, let's just get this done. Let's put the Premier back into power, get this thing built, get our AFL team up and running, and then we can worry about some of the other spending down the track. This new poll also asking the question, who is the preferred leader? We do have Rockliff on 43% and Dean Winter, the Labor leader, on 30%. So clearly Rockliff is fairly popular despite maybe the Liberal Party not being as popular. Of course, Dean Winter was the individual who basically lodged the no confidence motion in Parliament, partly as a result of the stadium. There was a lot of question marks around would Labor continue to support the stadium if they would win. The official line is they do support the stadium because it is creating a lot of jobs for Tasmanians, but some people caught out in a few interviews where the Labor leader and some of the other Labor politicians were saying, well, we're supportive of a stadium, but not necessarily the Macquarie Point Stadium plan that has been put together. There was another proposal to build a stadium a little bit further up the Macquarie Point area there at Regatta Point. It would be majority privately funded in this plan. There is a former Tasmanian Labor Premier who has been a big proponent of this plan, but there really hasn't been much feasibility studies put together. There's not a lot of data around where the funding would come from. And it does just seem a little bit poorly thought out. And we did have Labor coming out and confirming after those interviews where they said, we do definitely 100% support the proposed Macquarie Point roofed stadium, 23,000 seats. You do have the transparent roof, of course. And this stadium, obviously, very important for the AFL. It would secure the Tasmania Devils licence. They would come in 2028. And the stadium at this stage still slated for a completion date in 2029. Now, the plan was for there to be a parliamentary vote in Tasmania around the stadium. The first part of the legislation was planned to go through the lower house in June. It was expected to pass because obviously in the lower house, a majority of the seats were held by Labor and the Liberals. The question mark was it going to pass the upper house vote, which was originally scheduled for July? Because, of course, you do have a bunch of independents, many of whom don't support the stadium. And, of course, a number of Greens members in the upper house who do not support the stadium full stop. But obviously, once this no confidence motion was passed, Rockliff came out and called the election and the vote was put on hold. So presumably post-election, if the Liberals win government, which you'd have to say looks more likely than not at this stage, that vote will presumably go back through the lower house and upper house. And most likely, depending on the results of the election, will be in a similar position to where it will depend on what some of those independents do in the upper house as to whether this vote passes. In terms of the Tasmanian electoral system, they do have a Hare-Clark voting system, which is basically a proportional allocation of seats depending on the proportion of votes that that particular party or candidate gets. So you can say roughly if any particular party or candidate gets 10, 15, 20% of the vote, they will roughly have that corresponding number of seats in Parliament. It is a little bit different to a lot of the other states and also the federal level, and it does mean that Tasmania has a lot of hung parliaments where you do have to have some sort of coalition government or minority government, and it does seem pretty likely in this case that that might happen again. In terms of the stadium, we did get a new rendering the other day, a very impressive video where it is sort of a fly-through of the exterior and the interior of the stadium. Obviously, this is a bit of a propaganda puff piece ahead of the election, but if you look at the stadium, it does look very impressive, of course. It is sort of like a mini Optus Stadium in a way. The concourses are pretty similar to Optus Stadium, and of course you do have the roof. It does look pretty impressive in the rendering. It did get a lot of attention in the media and on social media and that sort of thing. I did say in a previous video, potentially the most likely scenario was that there would be a stadium built of some description, but it may not be the original Macquarie Point plan. But potentially with these Liberal numbers, obviously they're looking really good. There is a chance that potentially they'll get a few more seats that they weren't expecting to before. And now you're not relying on some of those independents who may or may not vote for the stadium depending on what other policies they might be able to negotiate with the Liberals on. So this is a pretty promising update if you are a pro-stadium person, pro-AFL team person. Obviously been a lot of talk about the Devils in the media in the past couple of months. I do think possibly the narrative has shifted to where the AFL may be accepting it's getting a bit too late to cancel the team even if the stadium does fall over or is delayed. But really there's nothing that we can really ascertain at this point before this election has been run and won. But it is getting to the point where potentially this Tasmania Devils team will be playing in the VFL next year. We have got a bunch of offices, a bunch of team stores and things like that opening up over Tasmania. And the longer this drags on, you just think the AFL can't possibly cancel this even if the stadium doesn't get built. Potentially with the delays in the election, we could see maybe 2030 opening instead of a 2029. The government's still saying if we get shovels in the ground late in 2025, which is the plan, it is still on target to open before the 2029 AFL season. But it really depends on the outcome of the election. If it is a clear Liberal victory in terms of the seats, they're not going to get a majority government because of how the Tasmanian voting system works. But if they can pick up an extra seat or two, potentially the path to getting this thing through Parliament becomes a lot easier. So we will wait and see what happens on July 19, that is the election date. But if it continues this way, you do have to say the Hobart Stadium is looking more and more likely every day. That is going to be all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.